So welcome, one of my favorite places, and a discussion about Supply Chain 2030. I don't think any of us know what it looks like, but it's my hope that together we can build a guiding coalition so that when you leave these doors, you're clear and you've met some great people that you can really rely on. Because as we think about Supply Chain 2030, I think it's so important, and I think it's about global conversations, and I believe it's about disruption and really innovating. So we're going to have a global conversation with this conference. We have about 5,000 people online that'll be watching us. We'll be taking questions from Twitter, and we're going to have you with table discussions, and we're going to have conversations together and learn together. Because I think that we can't put research behind firewalls. I think we need it to be open so that communities can evolve and we can create value. And we've developed some classes with CorpU, and CorpU is sponsoring our live streaming. And we want everyone to have a global conversation. So let's imagine Supply Chain 2030 together. Wow. Seems like just yesterday we were talking about Y2K, right? And would the world come to an end at Y2K? But it didn't. But 2030 offers so much opportunity if we can adapt to the quick pace of change. Now, I've got to give you a true confession. I've been an analyst for 15 years, and I spent about 12 years lying to people. I'm not proud of it. I believed that if I took technology and if I improved processes, that we could stand as supply chain leaders at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin, and we could drive results that look like this. But I no longer believe that. I think that organizations reach a pinnacle and they flatten. And the reason is that I think the processes that we've designed over the last 3 decades do not allow us to embrace complexity, do not allow us to really drive global interactions to the degree we need to for localized assortment, do not allow us to really get to data. And in fact, what I see are patterns like this one. Let's take Colgate. And I'm not picking on Colgate. 88% of companies look like this. If you look at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, Colgate, who is one of the leaders of the household products category and has really been very proud of IT standardization, has driven the highest return on invested capital of any industry peer in their group, is at the same level at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns in 2015 that they were in 2006. Is it because they didn't invest in technology? Absolutely not. Is it because they didn't invest in people? Absolutely not. It's about the fact that the world changed. Complexity increased. They became more global. And the supply chain did not adapt. But Colgate's not by themselves. This is the chemical industry. Look at DuPont. Look at Dow. 2006 is a starting point. Look at those lines. 2015, they're about the same place that they were in 2006. We invested 1.7% of revenue in technology. We have spent years working on continuous improvement processes. And many times people say, well, Laura, let's just lean out the supply chain. Let's just get a lot of lean initiatives together. But if that were true, why is Toyota at the same place in 2015 that they were in 2006? Toyota is the lean leader of the supply chain. And why has Honda not progressed? I don't think the answer is lean. I don't think the answer is the tightly integrated supply chain. I think we were too functional. We were too inside out, and we need to become outside in. Pharmaceutical, same story. Look at Bristol-Myers Squibb and Merck. But even worse, when you look at Merck, it lacks resiliency. Shareholders want dependability and results. 88% of companies are at the same place in 2015 that they were in 2006. I want you to change this. I want you to say, we don't have best practices. We need to change our minds. We need to hold ourselves accountable to the balance sheet. We need to think differently. We need to drive new outcomes. And that's what I want you to leave this conference with, is where can you go? The current state of supply chain, 1/3 of companies realize they're stuck, and more companies call me. And when I look at the companies that say they do it well versus the companies that say they don't do it well, at a 90% confidence level, these are the differences. Those that do it well have a much higher level of understanding by the executive team. No surprise. But we don't always have enlightened executive teams. They are better at supply chain visibility. We lack a common definition of supply chain visibility, but we're drowning in data and low on insights. They're better at organizational change management. They're much more aligned cross-functionally, and they can use data. Now, those are not small feats to accomplish. And when we look at the supply chains to admire, what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a methodology that we could learn from the companies that were driving balance sheet improvement. We wanted a way that we could help companies objectively benchmark their supply chains. It's not about a beauty contest. We wanted to understand how we could define a standard to improve research. Now, when I was at AMR, we developed the AMR Top 25, which became the Gartner Top 25. And when I sat at the table and we talked about it, it was only for very large companies. And at that point in time, we thought that 50% input would drive the right behaviors. But unfortunately, I think the Gartner Top 25 became a beauty contest. It became who had the best PR organization and who could lobby for the best scores. We wanted something that was data-driven. So we took financial data from 2009 to 2015, and we measured which supply chains were driving the most improvement, which supply chains were driving the highest level of value of price to tangible book, and which supply chains were performing the best on a balanced portfolio that's ties to market capitalization. We don't have all the answers. This is our 3rd year. But we want to drive a data-driven discussion. We want to help people to talk the language of the balance sheet. And so we divided 320 companies into industry peer groups. I just don't think you can compare Apple to Walmart. I don't think you can compare Shell to Procter & Gamble. And we started to evaluate on 2 periods, 2006 to 2015, 2009 to 2015. And originally, I wanted to go from 2006 to 2015 because I wanted to see which companies had driven the most improvement and the greatest resiliency across the recession. But I found that there had been so much merger activity that I couldn't do that. So I settled for 2009 to 2015. So the first thing we wanted to do was have an objective yardstick for improvement. So we developed the supply chain index. And the supply chain index takes these crazy orbit charts that I showed you with all the squiggly lines at the intersection and looks at the vector between the points of growth and return on invested capital, inventory turns and operating margin, and the tightness of the pattern. And we believe that companies that can drive growth, return on invested capital, inventory with tight patterns deliver the highest shareholder value. So we did the correlations to market cap. Now, what's interesting, though, is the companies that drive the highest rate of improvement typically have the most to lose. It's a lot like the game The Biggest Loser, or the TV show The Biggest Loser. And so those that run the highest index will often not be the best supply chains. They're just losing or improving faster. But then we also wanted to know which supply chains were driving the highest level of value. So we used a lot of indexes to try to develop this, and we settled on price to tangible book. And I remember when I wrote the book Bricks Matter, Keith Harrison, who was the director of supply for Procter & Gamble, used to ask me, Laura, what defines value? And I didn't have an answer. But today I stand in front of you and I say price to tangible book, I think, is a great answer. And so we looked at which supply chains were really driving price to tangible book, and then which supply chains had a balanced portfolio. You know, we say we want a balanced portfolio, but how do we measure it? And we measured it with growth, operating margin, inventory turns, return on invested capital. And what we see is that complexity will often throw the supply chain out of balance. And the ability to manage assets and complexity is really difficult. So what did we find? This took us about 6 months to do. And we first looked at 2006 to 2015, and we looked at 2009 to 2015. About 12% of companies met the mark of improvement, performance, and value for both time periods. But only 7 companies made the list for the 2 time periods. So then we started looking at what were the characteristics of these companies, and we selected 2009 to 2015 as where we were going to land. And tomorrow you'll see that we'll give each of these companies a digital image for the Supply Chains to Admire Award, and we'll also give them a plaque. And we want to stimulate a discussion around supply chain excellence. And these are the winners: Whole Foods, CVS, Carter's, Dollar Tree, Walmart, and Target. Look at the number of retail companies. Retail companies started the last decade as laggards, but they have quickly improved, and a lot of it has become driven by e-commerce and perpetual inventory signals and automation. But process companies over the last decade have steadily fallen out of my circle. They've not been able to really adapt to the changing environment. L'Oreal, I think, is a wonderful case study of dealing with complexity. Clorox will be talking tomorrow about customer-centric supply chains, and BASF will be talking about global organizations. But look at the discrete companies. As the market became tougher, the discrete companies really took it on themselves to be better at planning, better at network design, better at supply chain organizations, better at using channel data. And Cooper Tires, Apple, Steelcase, Edwards Life Sciences, Cummins Engine, Taiwan Semiconductor, and Cisco make the list. Now, in this list, I think it's very interesting that the only 2 effective value networks for companies are Walmart Retail Link and TSMC Digital Network. And I think that as we think about end-to-end, they're great examples of powering value networks. The rest of the companies have really driven more of enterprise-centric views. So we also said which companies were close, but maybe didn't make all of the performance factors, and then we rounded out our circle. This is a very data-driven view. It's not a beauty contest. And these companies are driving improvement and also value and also performance. So part of what I'm doing is I'm interviewing the companies and I'm asking the question, why? And that's going to be the next book that I'm starting to work on now. Tell me your story. Why do you think you were able to drive improvement when your peer group was not? And this is the pattern that I see. We focus on horizontal processes: revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development, corporate social responsibility. We believe in a balanced scorecard, 7 to 9 measurements. And we focus cross-functionally, but we've had consistency in leadership and culture. I've worked with some companies in my tenure of an analyst, 9 to 10 changes in leadership. It's impossible to drive this kind of value with those kind of changes in leadership. And they design the network. They don't inherit it. You know, I was a chemical engineer. I couldn't graduate unless I could design a distillation column and a heat exchanger. But so few companies design the network, form and function of inventory, and they're clear on supply chain excellence. That's a tough nut. What does supply chain excellence mean? That's one of the things I hope that you're clearer on when you leave here Friday. So what are my insights? You know, this is my 3rd year of doing it. When I stepped back, one of my first insights was only 2 companies were able to really keep balance when growth started to fall. It's much easier to improve performance and drive improvement when growth is increasing. But only 2 companies were able to change the supply chain and adapt when growth started to fall. And I think that's about design. It's about outward-facing processes that are really good at channel data with 0 latency. And I think it's about leadership. We're much better in growth than we are in the down markets. The second issue is, I think the process industries are like the frog in the beaker of water. I don't know if you remember this story. The frog in the beaker of water, when you start to turn up the water a little bit, he has to decide, is he going to jump because the water's too hot? Or is he going to stay and really become a boiled frog? The process industries have increased complexity. First it was 20% a year, then it was 25% a year, then it was 30% a year, and then it was 38% a year, adding items to the long tail of the supply chain. But the supply chain was not modified for that level of complexity. Whereas in high tech, because the short cycle and the decline in price, they really got serious about supply chain planning, network design, inventory strategies, and developing planning teams. The process industries were sort of like the frog in the beaker. The water got hotter. We became more global, but we didn't change our processes, and they didn't adapt. Third question was, what was value? And one of the things we did in preparation for this summit was we asked you to fill out a survey, and we appreciate the 60 people in the audience that answered it. And we asked you, what do you think drives price to tangible value? And that's one of the things we wanted to find out as part of this work. And the people in the audience said strategy and sales and operations planning effectiveness, and then maybe alignment, and then agility, and then ability to get to data, and visibility of the supply chain. An effective center of excellence, supplier reliability, globalization were lower, and IT strategy was last. Now, when I first started doing this research, I thought it would be alignment, I thought it would be agility, and I thought it would be data. But when we started looking at the 6,000 responses in our database and we started doing correlations of price to tangible book, what we found, the highest correlations were sales and operations planning effectiveness, visibility within the supply chain, particularly if we could get to 2nd and 3rd level of tiers of suppliers, the effectiveness of the supply chain center of excellence. And I think it's interesting, the supply chain strategy does not correlate, but the effectiveness of the supply chain center of excellence does. And so I've thought a lot about that, and I think it's because so often we have strategy, but we don't tie it to execution. And only 1 in 2 companies believe their supply chain centers of excellence are effective. And I think it's because we don't spend enough time asking ourselves, how do we drive value? But supplier reliability actually has a very high correlation to price to tangible book. And that's the quality of conformance to the quality of design and the reliability of materials. And I think what's happening as we get towards 2030 and we get to true demand-driven supply chains, we will start to use independent demand for MRP, for manufacturing, and we're going to improve our supplier relationships. And I think that's a great opportunity. And it was a surprise to me to see that those that had better supplier development programs actually had much higher correlation of price to tangible book. So that's where we are today. The process industries are like a frog in water. The heat's going up. The retail industries adapted with e-commerce. And the discrete industries made more progress than any other category. So what can we learn as we get ready for 2030? Well, I think one thing we've got to learn is that 12% of companies are actually driving improvement, driving performance, and driving value. So maybe we don't have everything just the way we need it. Maybe we need to think differently to drive new outcomes. We have a new generation of employee that's coming along, and we need to think about Supply Chain 2030 differently. It's a wonderful way for us to innovate. But it's tough for us to innovate because innovation to us usually means that we're going to make new products. Process innovation we struggle with. So many times people will call me up and they'll say, I want to be an innovator, Laura. And I'm great. Let's have the discussion. And then they're like, but I can only get funding if I can have a guaranteed return on investment in 1 year. I'm like, you know, you can't have it both ways, right? Innovation is about investment in process and really testing and learning and spending time and focus about how do we adapt and how do we drive new outcomes. And I think that together, we need to build this guiding coalition to unstick the supply chain, to really drive new outcomes, new business models, and learn together. I want us to take a different path. Tomorrow, when you hear the Internet of Things discussions, you're going to hear about 2 leaders that decided to redesign the supply chain to do things differently. They took a different path. We're going to talk about new business models. Amaris is going to talk about biomolecular engineering of yeast and feeding them waste streams. And perhaps we have small factories around the world that are very agile based upon waste. I never thought about that. We didn't used to have Uber. We're going to talk about the autonomous supply chain. We're going to talk about the learning supply chain. We're going to talk about how we can do things differently. So we asked you, we said, when you get ready for 2030, what is the most disruptive technology that you expect? What will have the greatest impact on 2030 and 2025? Analytics comes out as so important. But only 7% of companies today are investing in cognitive analytics, the learning systems. And in fact, most people, when I talk about rules-based ontologies and hypothesis engines and cognitive learning and prescriptive analytics, they'll stop and they'll say, what do you mean, Laura? Tell me, where can I get that? Who's doing it, right? It's about innovation. It's about the changing nature of the rules of our supply chain. The supply chain was built in the last 2 decades for very inflexible rules. Think about available to promise, allocation, inventory matching, single ifs to single thens. Is it any wonder that we're not agile? We need many ifs to many thens. We need systems that learn and adapt. And that's what cognitive learning is all about. We need systems that just don't give us exceptions, but tell us what to do. I envision 5 years from now that a planner will get a cup of coffee, go to the terminal, talk to the terminal like we talk to Siri on our phone, and the terminal will say, these are the things I changed last night and corrected, and these are the things I want you to look at today. And so I'll know the answers of the global supply chain probably at 8:30 versus 2 o'clock after today I go through all the exceptions. We are redefining decision support. And Internet of Things, right? Apache Spark, the open source networks. We are inventing streaming data architectures. It's exciting. The supply chain today reacts, it doesn't sense. It's always on the back foot. But what if we could use all the sensors, right? What if we could have machines talk to machines and we could redefine digital manufacturing? Think about all those programmable logic controllers, all the sensors on the floor. We take machines down based upon mean time failure. But what if we had digital manufacturing and sensors and Internet of Things that could tell us about when we need to service our manufacturing? Keith tomorrow from Linux is going to talk about the redefinition of service. Linux International with heating and air conditioning. He can never predict when an air conditioner is going to fail. They usually fail at the beginning of the summer season or the beginning of the winter season. But if he has Internet of Things in that air conditioner and we have streaming data, instead of calling for a service person that might come 2 days from now and give you a 4-hour window, he can knock on somebody's door and say, the bearing in your air conditioner is about ready to fail, and could I arrange to fix it? Proactive service, redefining service. And Chris is going to talk about redefining coffee replenishment. Costa Coffee, they decided when they put in the machines, they were going to sense and drive automatic replenishment. Coca-Cola, I go to my McDonald's and I have all the automated Coca-Cola machines, but they don't sense. It doesn't send a signal back to Coca-Cola. There's a choice we have. Internet of Things, streaming data. Think of all the GPS, the telematics signals, the sensors on our plant floors, the ability for us to have wearable devices. We're defining those architectures, and when you go to the digital showcase today, you'll see them. Stop and talk. We don't know what the Internet of Things architectures really will end up being. We're early, but they're very promising. And 3D printing, we're going to have a demonstration of 3D printing, but so much possibility, right? I was reading the other day that the Chinese printed a house, 23 hours, right? I'm building a house, I have to assemble everything, ship it long distances. But what if we could print a house? And what if we could print the medical device? You know, people, when they get knee replacements, 2 to 3 knees are driven to the hospital. We don't know which one's going to go in the human body. What if we can print it in the operating room? We're getting close. And tomorrow we're going to talk about robotics. And we're going to ask the question, why is China investing in robotics at a faster rate than we are in North America? Why are they building more adaptive supply chains than we are with the cost of labor? And what can a robot do? When you go to the digital showcase, you're going to see Sawyer. Sawyer's going to pick up lots of different things. In fact, I went shopping for Sawyer to pick up strange things. And you're going to see that he is very agile. As you watch Sawyer work, think about how could you use robotics? It's coming. It looks really different. And when we think about analytics, we must think about analytics holistically. It's no longer about reporting on top of enterprise resource planning, or how are we going to drive better concurrent planning and decision support. Instead, we have to think about clouds, data that can move across organizations, across systems, across companies. We have to think about streams. And not every piece of data needs to fly first class, right? But streaming data architectures are very different than pools or lakes. And data lakes need to form for structured and unstructured data so that we can harvest data to give the answers to the questions we don't know to ask, which are usually about some kind of quality recall or warranty issue or market opportunity. So as we think about analytics, we have new forms of analytics, but we need to map a holistic data strategy that is not constrained by today's technology taxonomies of enterprise resource planning and warehouse management and transportation planning. Instead, we need to think holistically about data, how it moves in clouds, how it streams, how it pulls, and how can we use new insights. So when we ask people, when you think about 2030, what analytic technique is the most important to drive supply chain performance in 2030? And these are the answers. Now, data visualization's pretty easy. A lot of investment today in digital visualization. In fact, 80% of companies have some sort of tool. But if we think about cognitive reasoning or sentiment analysis, which is the reading of social sentiment and Internet of Things and concurrent optimization, 75% of this is about new technologies that don't have well-defined taxonomies. It's about innovation in processes, and about thinking differently. Right? We can't just see data. Data needs to pull and stream, and we need to drive new insights. And it needs to work for us. We're drowning in data and low on insights. Now, I find one of the biggest ironies is the fact that today we've never had more innovation. I wrote a report last night about analytics. I was looking at all the new forms of analytics that have been developed in the last decade. And when I did research in 2006, and I asked companies, are you an innovator? Are you an early adopter? Are you a laggard? I had a bell curve. I had an equal number of early adopters and an equal number of laggards. Today, in the face of amazing innovation, we're becoming more and more conservative. I have more leaning last or conservative buyers than I have innovators in the face of tremendous innovative change. Why is that? Is it because technology is happening so fast we can't absorb it? Is it because we're so busy with yesterday's technologies and upgrades that we can't rise above the fray and say, let's do it differently? Is it because the business pressure is so short term because 88% of our supply chains aren't making improvement? I think all three are true. But the future to 2030, I think, says we've got to think differently. We've got to embrace new forms of analytics. We've got to learn, how do we use Hadoop? And how do we define Internet of Things? And how do we embrace Apache Spark? And how do we really define cognitive learning? Those are new terms for most people. And how do we wrangle data from very large data sources and mine unstructured text? The traditional supply chain is all about relational data. If we can't stuff it in a database, we're not happy, right? But tomorrow, 2030, is about unstructured data. It's about weather. It's about GPS data. It's about sensor data. And it's about thinking about things differently. So I have 5 predictions for 2030. And as we go along the program, I'm going to ask others to give you their predictions, and I'm going to have you talk amongst yourselves, because I don't think we know what it looks like, but I sure hope we're more successful in 2030 than we are today. And my first prediction is that we're going to build outside-in processes. Now, today, we have a lot of really good intentions about customer segmentation, about cost to serve, about translation of customer data into demand signals. But we haven't gone very far with all this, right? Customer data stays in sales and marketing, and so often I'll introduce supply chain teams to marketing teams. And I've spent a decade talking about demand-driven, and I can only count 5 companies that I think have made a lot of progress. But as we go outside in, and we cross over the commercial teams, and we build value networks, and we use channel data, we will redefine our ability to have the supply chain as the engine of growth. We can test and learn, we can sense, we can drive localized assortment, we can create new business models. We've got to really unstick the supply chain to be a functional organization that is using shipment and order data for demand. We've got to really drive new forms of analytics that allow us to tie policy to action. The learning supply chain is here. Tonight, Steve DeAngelis from Intera Solutions is going to be presenting with Capgemini in a cognitive learning small classroom. Go listen. Think about the rules-based ontology, which this slide depicts. Think about it crossing a value network or crossing your organization, And at each circle, a green circle could be predictive analytics, a red circle could be prescriptive analytics, a yellow circle could be cognitive analytics. And think about a rules-based ontology and a hypothesis engine that can learn and sense and adapt and really help your supply chain to not just be driven by fixed rules that don't adapt. I also think that we're going to become much more socially responsible. The increase in consumer activism, consumers will vote with their feet. We see it already, the global citizen. We stand for corporate social responsibility. 75% of non-renewable resources go through our supply chains. 65% are in the extended network. And when we look at the research, 92% of companies have corporate social responsibility goals. Over 70% make a marketing claim, fair labor, energy, water. But only 20% of companies own their network. And 65% of the non-renewable resources are outside the four walls of the network. So if we're going to save the planet, and if we're going to create new value, we've got to embrace the network. And we've got to really think about the network of networks. I am firmly convinced that the network of networks is not my ERP to your ERP. It's not about one-to-one signals. It's about really recreating the network to be many-to-many. Transportation providers to suppliers to customers. And it's about many-to-many data models. And this is my drawing on the right-hand side. I have 4 trading partners, and we know it's hundreds and thousands of trading partners, but it's a many-to-many architecture that we don't have today. And I think there's a canonical infrastructure which defines the processes. And there's a rules-based ontology that replaces the need for standards and master data. And there's visualization and benchmarking and sensing, and there's cognitive learning. And then in the center with blockchain, I think we have the ability to pass documents and really drive financial information. Twice a year, we have a small group that's meeting to work on what would the network of networks look like. And on the left-hand side, you can see one of the participants' drawings. We don't know what it really looks like, but you can see that her drawing is a little bit like mine, right? It's many-to-many. It's about the ability to write once. People in the sessions will say, well, I want the network of networks to be a lot like when I plug in my cellular phone and I travel from country to country, and I don't have to plug in, right? There's a directory. And the network of networks is, I think, a great opportunity for us because really the internet has helped us with business to consumer, but not business to business. Not the ability for us to really run manufacturing and work with our suppliers better, right? Today it takes 60 days to get a new supplier onboarded. It is very difficult to do business. 27% of orders will actually move hands-free. We've not done as much with digital as we could. But in this small group, people will say, well, what is the return on investment, Laura? If we have this network of networks and we work together for a guiding coalition, what will be my value? And in fact, when we ask you, what's your biggest barrier for the network of networks? This is the answer we got, right? I don't understand what the value is, right? Traditional supply chain thinking, unclear ROI, technology not ready. I think the technology is getting ready, right? I think the problem is that we're so used to automating the enterprise that we're not willing to really embrace what could be in the network of networks. I'd like to share a video with you now. And this is the video of the creator of the internet. In 1989, a man in England sat down and defined the internet, a single man, and had an idea. And I want you to think about what could the network of networks look like. Let's roll the video.
When the web started 25 years ago, It was only its openness to people innovating on it. But now when we look back over 25 years, almost half the people in the world are using the web. But I think some of us initially had big hopes that the internet is going to lead to a society in which inequality fades away because everybody has got the same possibilities, everybody has got the same advantages, just starting off connecting themselves to the net. Guess what? That hasn't happened. In fact, here we are 25 years after the first web page, and a lot of non-profits, a lot of governments are realizing that we have a crisis of inequality. And so every time people put more powerful things on the web, we actually increase the gap between the haves and the have-nots. Things need to be said explicitly for the internet because the internet gives you a certain power that you wouldn't have had before. As people have started to think about access to the internet more as a right, then that begs the question, okay, should we have a Bill of Rights for the internet? Snowden changed that dramatically by putting those revelations onto the table, that it really started the conversation. And I think we're indebted to Edward Snowden for actually introducing that material in a way that I think nothing else could have done that. There have always been forces to try to control the internet. When you're a government of a country, it's very tempting to want to govern the internet within your country. Trouble is, it doesn't work, because the internet is not a thing of countries. You can put in barriers, you can put in firewalls, but as you do that, suddenly your country, your people, your entrepreneurs, your teachers have all lost their voice. We have to be reactive when we realize that, whoa, actually this country or this company has stepped over the mark, and we have to immediately take to the streets with placards and shouting. So in 10 years' time, we'll see certain natural progressions. We'll see the internet speeds be very high, so it'll get to the point where the internet will be able to carry everything that your eyes can perceive, just as when you listen to stereo, the internet can feed you anything your ears can hear. It gets enough fidelity. Whether the internet is an open space or a closed space, I'm not going to predict. It's up to us. It all decides on what we do now, on the decisions we make now.
Do you think Tim asked the question, what's the return on investment? No. He had a vision. Today our supply chains are stuck. We can't communicate across one company to another company to a value network. We've talked about it for decades. I think that we have the power in this room to build a guiding coalition, to build the network of networks, redefine transportation. We've fundamentally not made improvement in the number of empty miles, the ability to onboard suppliers, the ability to drive manufacturing schedules, and I think we can. And as we think about the supply chain of 2030, I think we've got to embrace it as the engine of growth. The supply chain can test, can sense, can learn, can adapt if we can connect it to outside-in data, if we can free ourselves from inflexible rule sets and the technology from 2 decades ago. We must build outside-in processes. We must learn to test and learn and adapt. And ultimately, we will build new business models. Just as Keith tomorrow will talk about redefining service, I want you to think about how can you use the technologies tonight in the digital showcase, the technologies that you're going to learn about through entrepreneurs sharing their information, from learning from each other to drive new business models. Because what we have today is not working. And we were doing the videos today, and someone had this quote, and I thought it was a great quote. This came from the 13th century. Run from what's comfortable. Forget safety. Live where you fear to live. Destroy your reputation. Be notorious. Seize supply chain 2030. It is yours to drive new value. So at this conference, I've designed the program so we can imagine 2030 together. I think no one in this room has the answers. But I think you'll leave this conference with better clarity. Now, you can't put on a conference like this without sponsors. And I appreciate Bristol Cone sponsoring the keynote today. I appreciate the partnership with CorpU for the education materials that we've built. They're going to be showcasing them in the digital showcase. I appreciate Intera with their work on the digital showcase, and John Galt tomorrow night with the reception, and Canaxis with the book giveaway that we're going to do tomorrow, and Ortec with the 5K run, which I'll be at the end of the pack, right? And Alemica will be sponsoring the post-event webinar, and E2 Open and Tools Group and Halo. I want you to spend time with the sponsors. I appreciate them. I think you can see who's not there. These are the innovators. And embracing working with you. The other thing is you can't put on a conference without a team. And this is the Supply Chain Insights team. And we're here to serve you. And Allison is running our social program, and Regina is running the back of the house and client services, and Heather is doing all the research, and Helen is working on the training materials, and Jill and Mikey have worked on the back office. Stop and talk to us and tell us how we make this better, how we make the research better for you. Because we believe we need to be the disruptor of the analyst world in the face of disruption. Research shouldn't be behind firewalls. So with that, we're going to be doing networking throughout the conference. On the back of your badge are 4 numbers. Your first seat assignment, which is your first set of new friends. Then tomorrow morning, we'll ask you to sit at a different table, which will be your second set of new friends. And then your third set on Thursday afternoon, and then your fourth on Friday. And throughout the conference, we're going to ask you to really imagine together, to think differently, and drive new outcomes. Because our goal is that you'll help us to build a guiding coalition. Think differently, drive new outcomes, learn together. Imagine Supply Chain 2030.